Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of 6 Degrees of Associations. I'm your host, Lucas McCann. With me today, Andrew Chamberlain, co-founder and chief development officer of Elevated. Welcome, Andrew.
Oh, thank you very much, Lucas. It's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to be on the other side of the podcast microphone for a change. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
It is nice to be interviewed sometimes when you spend your time interviewing folks and doing that side of it. Now you just have to sit back and answer some questions, right? Easy peasy.
Oh my God, I'm just going to make stuff up. By the time we get to the end of this podcast, my whole CV will be something completely different to reality. So I'm totally excited about it.
Our producer, Casey, probably won't have to edit anything out because it'll just be pure entertainment from what I gather.
From start to finish.
He won't even edit out any curse words, I promise. Well, we'll see. No promises from Casey. But well, Andrew, tell us a little bit about your current seat at Elevated, what you guys are doing there, and then we'll talk a little bit, maybe backtrack and how you found associations. But let's start with Elevated.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, Elevated, we're a niche consultancy, which I use as fancy words for small. Small consultancy. Yeah, specialized. That's right. That's a really good one. Expert. Yeah, right. We're a we specialize in. Well, we have two aspects of our work. One, we specialize in developing and delivering professional education programs for associations. So, we go in-house, develop their training programs, their certification, accreditation programs, and then deliver them. And all that's involved in that piece. And then on the other side is the what we call the leadership support piece, which is primarily where in the business I work, which is around working with boards of directors, C-suite, leadership teams on their personal development. So I do a lot of coaching, a lot of one-to-one with aspiring chief executives or new, unseasoned chief execs and exec directors.
Both need guidance sometimes, yes.
Well, sometimes, yeah. Sometimes
and by sometimes, I mean all the time, right? You can, even if you course correct just a degree or two, that's important.
Yeah. It's enough. And actually, I spend a lot of time with people who just need that kind of opportunity to vent, download, sense check that they're not seeing it in a completely bizarre way, the world. So I spend a lot of time doing that. And then I also work with the boards around facilitating strategic planning and then looking at the whole governance piece. Helping people, volunteers and staff understand what in the association world, what constitutes good corporate governance. And the work takes me, everywhere. I work internationally. We have clients in Australia, South Africa, Canada, UK, Europe, and of course the US. So, my business partner is based over in Minnesota. So, I'm in the UK. She's over there. So I spend an awful lot of time in the Delta Lounge at various airports around the world. Although sadly they don't have one in London. But
oh no, yeah. You better make a call.
Indeed.
Well, one, I'm excited to find out I have a new person I can call and vent to. That's good and important. So
always.
I will do that for sure. Number two, let's clarify. We'll come back to the governments later in the show. I know we will. That's an important topic and going to be a fun topic, and talking about the civic duties of associations and how much we're focused or not focused sometimes on that. But on the education programs, let's clarify just a little bit. You all do strategy, design, and implementation. Is that how far do you go?
The whole piece. So we'll take it from inception. So, someone will say, right, we want to put out the door a leadership academy. We want the X Association Leadership Academy, but we don't know what it's going to look like, and we don't know how to structure it, and we don't really know how to design it or who's going to deliver it. So, we'll go in and, as you say, strategize with the organization and say, right, what's the purpose of this? Why are you delivering this education? Why do you want this leadership academy? And then we'll sort of take that information, digest it, turn it into a proposed sort of structure. Be it everything from it's a 3-week intensive online through to it's a weekend boot camp through to it's an ongoing 12-month certification program. So we'll do and we'll then work with the volunteers who contribute the content and deliver the content. We don't do that. That's not our wheelhouse. We'll work as instructional designers, put that piece together, and then work with, as I say, those volunteers to deliver. We'll do all of it, all the other kind of administrative pieces around it, and then at the end of the training or whatever it is, the leadership academies concludes. We'll then follow up with the evaluation piece, understanding what worked, what impact we had. So part of the exercise is also, identifying not just the purpose of the program, but how are we going to measure success? How do we understand what KPIs are, what benchmarks we're going to be using, so that an association can realize real value from its education piece, rather than what, and you'll have seen this as well, and I'm sure our listeners will have experienced this, rather than what is often the case is sort of random ad hoc training events, which is fine, which is good. We need those. But I think sometimes just sort of being able to stand back and say, right, well, actually, what is the real value of an education program to our members and also to the organization as well, so that's the piece that we lead on for clients.
Yeah, I was going to jump, but I'm going to pull on this thread just a little bit more because I think it's important. There are lots of general training programs out there, but from a value perspective of the association, in a lot of cases, they can be much more specialized and custom, I'll call it, to the membership. And I could see, it could come out of a strategic planning that, hey, we want to do one of these. To me, it's a little bit like, I want to buy a pickup truck. Well, like, why do I want to buy a pickup truck? And so when they come to you and they say they want to do this, and you ask them, why do you want to do this? I'm curious as to what most people say, and I assume some of them are after revenue generation, some of them is just pure value, some of them is member demand. But what do you hear some of the reasons, and so what our audience should be thinking about in terms of, hey, are we thinking about this in the right way? Maybe?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the time, associations will say, well, that's what we do. That's what we do. We deliver training. And you think, right, okay, well, we need, and we'll come on to this in a wee while when we talk about, strategic, leadership and impact. But actually, when you really challenge people to think about it, yeah, they do. And they're honest about it.
Yeah.
Many chief execs and CFOs will turn around and say, well, for us, it's an income generator. Primarily, we're putting it out the door because it makes us money.
Right.
And then others will say, well, it's a loss. It's a loss making, exercise. But actually, our purpose is bigger than making money. We're here to have an impact and a value to our members. So, it does vary. It does vary quite a lot. I think what we are seeing now is more and more associations are recognizing that there are gaps that they can fill that are missing within their industries. We work a lot with medical societies and clinical societies, and the highly specialized provision that they're putting out the door is stuff that you simply wouldn't, the members are not getting anywhere else. Right. And, so they understand then that this education program at the core of their business is their USP. That's their unique selling point. Because again, when you stand around and I spend a lot of time with organizations and challenge them and say, what is your unique selling point? Why do you even exist?
Right.
And, and it's always, because we're here to, support our members, have a network, be the go-to for, the sort of generic sort of explanations as to why the association exists. But actually, the guys who are really positioning their education programs as the focal point of their value proposition, well, they're churning over not just financial value. They're realizing significant member value, but they're also realizing significant sort of policy value. Because then they're generating through their education programs. They're generating really good data about what members are and aren't learning, on how they're applying it and where they're applying it. And then they're taking that data and applying it to real-time circumstances in members' professions. And suddenly, from an advocacy or lobbying position or a policy advocacy position, you've got a huge amount of real data that's informed by not just members' experience of their outside world, but of their experience within their membership world as well. I love education. For me, when I talk to when I facilitate strat planning and people are talking about, what should be the focal point, for me, the education piece is always, I think, should be the centerpiece of what you deliver. That's just my opinion. And of course, education can be all sorts of different things. This podcast is an educational resource potentially, maybe not with me on it particularly, but other guests, it's a huge educational resource. So, and I think recognizing that, we talk all the time about the value and impact of academic credentials. What degree do you have? What masters have you got? What PhD have you got? But actually, the more that we're talking about the professional accreditation, and what the value of that is, I think the more we're discussing that, the easier it becomes, and the value that accreditation has to an individual member in their career, the more I'm seeing boards appreciate, actually putting education at our core, that kind of makes real sense, business sense, and also, real value for our members.
Well said. I mean, I was throwing that out there. I wanted to pull on the thread because I hope you'd say exactly what you just said. And what I heard you say was, yes, some approach you specifically to create these programs for financial gain, but the ones that are very successful are there to educate the industry, educate the individuals that make up for it, and the money will follow. And if you ask all these folks in our culture today, the ones that we've deemed has been, quote, successful, I say financially successful. And, you say, hey, if you have your last $50,000, what are you going to do? And aside from the Grant Cardones who will say invest in real estate, the rest of them will say, well, I'd educate myself and I'd train myself in a specific manner so that I can be more successful. And that changes everything.
And that directly links back then to your recruitment and your retention strategy. Rather than scrabbling around and saying, right, how are we going to enhance our value proposition? How are we going to add value to those members who've been on the in the organization for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Actually linking the value proposition to a member's career trajectory, and therefore the education proposition to that member's experience of the association. Well, your retention strategy just writes itself.
I'm very cognizant of what my teenagers absorb. And one of the things that I feel like is a trend, and maybe I'm being overly sensitive, is this idea that higher education, college, for example, isn't worth the money, right? I can go out and I can be an entrepreneurial spirit and there's no need to do all that. I'm just going to go out and make my way in the world. And I think that's very dangerous. However, there is some merit to the sense of, okay, college as an institution has changed a lot, the value proposition of which is questionable, but it doesn't mean you can't go out there and find education. I think that's really important. Is Absolutely. You still need to go out there and educate yourself when you leave the proverbial nest. It's so important that whether it's through a Fortune 500 company that offers all these certifications, so you can get Amazon certified and all these things, or LinkedIn certified, or more importantly, you find an industry where you're really passionate about and you want to pursue, and have them provide you essentially a higher level of education.
I think, if in a US context, you talk about the Certified Association Executive, that credential, the value and the impact of that is huge. It's huge. Now, we don't have that in the UK context. We don't have. In fact, I was talking to a colleague this morning who's a former chief executive. He's retired. He spent, the last 30 years working at C-suite level in membership organizations in the UK. And I was talking to him about leadership, and I mentioned something, and I mentioned or, the CAE, the Certified Association Exec, and I think what we want to be doing in the UK is how do we replicate that or import it or whatever. And he turned around and he said, oh, I'd never heard of that.
Yeah.
And I was like, right, okay. And I thought, well, and that for me is exactly why we've got these aspiring professionals in the industry, in the membership industry, who are struggling to progress in often because they have no reference point, if you like. We have no equivalent, and so they end up, we end up losing them. Potentially. And I think that's dreadful. Because actually you come into this industry, the membership world, however you fall into it. And I think, for us in the UK context, to be devoid of that opportunity, to have those credentials and that sort of recognition that you have committed to and you continue to invest in your own personal education, and your own personal professional development, I think it's a real travesty. And I hope we can rectify that sooner rather than later. But yeah, the education piece is, and again, the fact that ASAE has nicely positioned the CAE as a focal point of the membership industry. It's put
big value. Yeah.
It's put education at the centre of its value proposition.
Yeah. It's great. And there's many other layers in that, right? There's networking and other things, but I do like that they've stood by that, right? I'm sure they have no shortage of thoughts and ideas and ways that they can help connect the community and do all these other things, but they've stood their ground and said education is important. I think that's a strong symbol.
Absolutely. And everything else we can hang off it. And you can access everything else at different points. You don't have to be engaged in the education program to access the networking activities, the conference, right, the podcasts, the webinars. You don't have to be pursuing a formal credential. Right. However, they've created a virtuous learning cycle whereby if I want to, I can. And everything I do is linked to my personal education. I think it's a brilliant model, and I would ideally want to see, like I say, when I walk in and facilitate strategy planning, unless there's an obvious reason, we don't do education because, and in the UK, we have the Royal Colleges, for example. So, you have the Royal College of general practitioners, or you'll have the Royal College of Nursing, or what have you, and they will be kind of the educational focal points. So actually, you have what the membership organisations are, more sort of professional peer support networks. Well, fair enough. I can see you don't want to be reinventing the wheel if someone else is doing a brilliant job over there. But otherwise, if you don't have, in my opinion, for what it's worth, if you don't, or you're not moving education toward the centre, then I think long term you're going to be one of those organisations who is struggling to justify itself in the future. Yeah,
well said. So you mentioned in there, how you find your way to the industry. I want to jump back in time for a second and have you tell us a little bit maybe how you found this industry and a little bit about Andrew's background and what landed you here and what keeps you here.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I think everybody I speak to practically has fallen into the membership world, and I'm no exception. I started my career in central government, so I worked for the Scottish government up in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and I then worked for the New Zealand government down in Wellington for a couple of years, and I worked, in the public environment, but it was very much in that kind of central civil, as a central government civil servant sort of perspective.
Yeah.
And it was within that context that I bumped into membership bodies. I was working in a policy area around environmental sustainability. When I was working, I came back, I was working in government again. And I just literally, in a conference, bumped into someone, was introduced to them, this is the chief exec of the Environmental Association for Universities and Colleges. And I was like, right, okay. No idea what you do. Honestly, I had no real perception of what membership organisations did. And But then, started working with them, started to appreciate that, in this context, Scottish government was working with this organisation in partnership to drive forward policy priorities. And for me, that was a real eye-opener about the impact that government can have by utilising the resources and the skills and the expertise, not just the cash resources, but the human capital, the energy and the enthusiasm that volunteers and professional staff in associations bring to the table. That really opened my eyes to it. And then subsequently, I got a job with the same organisation, and that was my first sort of. They said, "Oh, we want to open a Scotland office for this association. We want to work with Scottish universities, Scottish colleges, and do you want to head it up for us?" I'm like, right, okay. And I had no experience working in the membership world, but I totally blagged the interview. And, and I promised them all sorts of things that I over-delivered on, of course. And I went in and I set up the Scottish office. And so, the whole kit caboodle of finding the office space, recruiting the staff, putting in place the structures to make it work, to make it function, and headed that up for a couple of years, and then moved on then to my first chief executive position. So I went from being the head of the Scotland office for one organisation to being the chief executive for the Association of Research Managers and Administrators down in Cambridge in the UK. Not an academic focused. The association was for professional staff, not academic staff, but it was working in that university environment. And then I worked there for, headed that up for me. And again, did the same thing in the sense that they were a voluntary group. They'd hit their ceiling. They had the cash. They just didn't have the resources to deliver what they wanted. They were looking for their first CEO, set it up, recruit the staff, find the office space, put all the policies and procedures in place, get it all up, get it all running. And so I did that for many years. And then I moved into consulting because I decided I didn't like being a chief executive.
Well, fair enough.
I didn't like it. So then I went into consulting.
Plenty out there that would agree with you.
Yeah. There aren't many who I'd like to admit it publicly, but for obvious reasons. But yeah, I did not enjoy it at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We got a chance, to chat a little bit, before we jumped on here. And one thing I noticed was, I'd say, I won't say one area of passion. I'm going to speak for you. You could tell me, punch me in the mouth if you say I'm saying something wrong. But one of the things that I think you're passionate about that keeps you in the industry, I'll speak for that, but also maybe one of the opportunities, and that's a nice way of saying things that get you riled up, is this idea of lost opportunity in the civic duty of associations. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I think you nailed it, Lucas. I think you've nailed it there. Yeah, I am passionate about, you're right, about the impact and the value that membership organisations...
The influence.
Yeah, the influence that they can wield, and I've seen it firsthand. I've experienced it firsthand, from both sides, the government side and the association side, and I've seen the value that organisations can realise on a social level as well as kind of on a profession-focused level, or indeed the individual level. And for me, yeah, the civic role, or the role that associations can play in civic society, is huge. And I think as we're coming up to what now, the quarter mark of the 21st century. Right. Things are chaotic, to say the least. Out there, there's so much going on. There's so many different challenges on a global level that we're having to deal with, and have been dealing with. For the last, talk about the turbulent 20s is an understatement. But
maybe dealing with, maybe some cases not. But yeah. Yeah,
but indeed. But for me, the real opportunity that associations can have in positively impacting their they're professional communities, maybe they're local communities, maybe they're national, communities, is really huge, and I think it's untapped at the moment. And I think it's because, I think we're not necessarily having that conversation. We're in the boardroom. We're not necessarily having that conversation. It's quite a big conversation to have. If you're an organisation and you start talking about social purpose, that's quite a big sort of deviation from the direction you've been perhaps steering for forever. And so I totally appreciate why boards of directors don't necessarily want to have the conversation or aren't having the conversation. But for me, I think in lieu of any kind of meaningful sort of, I'm being unfair, but in lieu of the ability of governments to have local or indeed regional impacts, because we think of associations like oil tankers who take forever to turn around. I mean, trying to get governments to turn around is almost impossible. So in any time frame,
leading by committee is not as necessarily effective in terms if you're just strictly basing that on a timeline.
Why did you did swear at me? You just said the C word to me, and it's the number one thing I absolutely can't stand is in the membership.
I promise you, it was on purpose.
In the membership world is groupthink and leadership and decision making by committee drives me up the wall, and I think it links to something that another thing I'm hugely passionate about, which links to all of that we've been talking about, is professionalism, or maybe not. The lack of professionalism I sometimes encounter, in the boardroom. That it all sort of points to these issues, these headaches that I had. That it's how I make my living. Partly how I make my living. I get parachuted into these environments because, boards are perhaps struggling to understand, what they should be doing, and so I shouldn't complain too much about it. Otherwise, I'll be out of work. But in terms of...
There's plenty of work.
Yeah.
That one you're not going to solve overnight or over a decade. Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to stop trying. I'm not going to stop trying.
Absolutely. Or should you? Yeah.
Because we've been talking, we've spoken at length about, education. And for me, that's... And every association talks about professionalism and the professionalization or enhancing the ability of their members as professionals. And going back to we spend so much time and energy as individuals, as professionals in this membership industry, as staffers, invested in our professional development. We've spoken about the CAE. We recognise that as staff we have to have a certain level of competence, of confidence, of capabilities. We absolutely have got to start applying that principle to our boardrooms. And for me, there's a tension at the moment in the membership environment, and it's international. This tension permeates the global membership world, which is between professionalism and volunteerism. And this, I think, feeble excuse that, they're volunteers, so we just should be grateful that they're there. And actually, to my mind, I don't care if you're a volunteer. Once you're through the door, that's brilliant. I care that you're going to volunteer, but once you're through the door, it's nothing. It makes no difference to me whether you're paid or not paid. You have to be able to demonstrate a degree of professionalism, competence in the boardroom, because you're making significant decisions there, accepting significant accountability, legal liability for your decision making. And too often, the reason I'm getting parachuted into these board environments, or I'm seeing strategic plans fail, or I'm seeing chief executives on the verge of a breakdown, I'm listening to chief executives, having a breakdown, is because the governance piece and the governance as leadership concept isn't being fully embraced in the board environments. And Lisa on our podcast, Lisa says to me all the time, don't get Andrew started on on boards and governance, and she's right. You shouldn't have, but you did, and it's your fault now, Lucas. You're gonna have to.
I owned it. I mean, I owned it. Well, let me ask you a question then, because we're there on this topic. We don't have to stick it, but so it is an issue, right? And you see people that if it gets toxic enough, people just leave the environment. They'll move to another association. People bounce around in our industry quite often. It's a thing, and so. At the risk of maybe pointing the finger, and I think I like the word accountability better in this instance, but short of hitting the factory reset button, what do you advise as steps? First, you have to be self-aware to understand that, hey, I'm in this environment, I'm contributing in some form or fashion. That takes a real leader. And then, what is step 1 or step 1.5, in that? How do you do it? Again, short of blowing everything up and factory resetting, which I imagine sometimes is the recommendation, but
a couple of times it has been the recommendation, but really that
rare,
is
rare.
It's education. It's education. It's training, development. How unfair is it of us to seek volunteers to come into the board environment and assume to know that they know how to govern, that they understand corporate governance. It's so wrong of us to say, oh, yeah, it's brilliant that you're a volunteer. Let's celebrate you. Let's put you up there and say, brilliant, we've got our new president-elect, our new treasurer, whatever. But then not provide you with professional development. And I don't mean... because again, I talk with a lot of organizations and they say, we give our directors induction. And they don't. They give them a folder full of paperwork that's to do with the organization's financial position, internal HR policies, and, a copy of the marketing plan. And then...
And here's the website.
Yeah, and there's the website. Yeah, exactly. And if you've got any comments, come back. And then that's when you get this situation where... these poor people are feeling abandoned. They're coming into the board environment. They're being expected to contribute, but really are lacking the confidence to do it because they don't really know what gaps they're supposed to be plugging. And invariably then they plug the gaps that they perceive and they go to their default position, which is where we're going to get into the weeds of operations, rather than... governing the organization. We're going to micromanage the chief executive. And as a chief executive, I've been in board meetings where we have gone through the bank statement, line by line, me justifying why, I spent $10 on a Subway when I could
make me fall asleep, Andrew, on my own pod here.
Exactly,
if you keep talking like
it's
that.
like governance is so boring when you do it like that. When you do it like that, it's so dull. But if you can walk in that boardroom and be strategic, be courageous, be creative, the opportunity, the governance, the opportunity, well, I then call it a professional privilege.
Yeah.
That is a professional privilege to have that opportunity to influence the long-term direction and success of your membership body, your professional association. That, for me, is why governance is exciting. I can't think of anything duller than sitting there going through tedious reports of stuff that we've done. All right, great.
That's not really, I was going to add to your list transparency. That's not the transparency that you need in that environment. No. There is certainly a level of being genuine and being transparent at a very high level. And then the other adjective I would add that really, in my opinion, makes for a more effective meeting is the inspiration part of it. I think that goes back to all of the civic duties that you should be filtering your lens or starting, right? It's almost bigger than vision sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And people say to me, well, how much time should we be spending on the kind of compliance piece, the fiduciary oversight? I say, well, assuming you've got your processes in place and your checks and balances, a board meeting... 5 minutes,
yeah,
and even then, only if it's a red or an amber issue, and otherwise, don't
you have to be talking about that more than that. Then the train is falling off the tracks. Right?
Absolutely,
you got other problems.
Absolutely, yeah, you've got bigger problems than that. Absolutely, if there's no money in the bank, how on earth did you get to that point in the first place? So, Yeah, and actually spend 95% of your time engaging and discussing, trends, competition, analyzing your environment, horizon scanning, talking about opportunities, but big picture stuff. That's where the exciting piece of governance is for me. Yeah, I'm fully on board with anybody who says governance is boring when you experience it like that, kind of in the weeds. Yeah, it is as dull as dishwater. Who's got time for
When
that?
it's done wrong, it's
Terrible.
It's
Terrible.
walking backwards instead of forwards.
And it does nothing. And it does nothing to. Well, it does nothing to support your chief executive and the C-suite and your leadership team and your staff. All it does is undermine their position. And again, invariably you've got a chief executive who's a certified association executive. They kind of know what they're doing, And that's not to say we don't need. Well,
you'd hope in certain areas, yes.
That's not to say you don't have to have your checks and balances. Of course you do, and you have to have your your processes for reporting and accountability. Of course you do, but that's not every moment of every board meeting.
No, you have to be. I mean, every CEO has different gifts, and being self-aware, as we mentioned, enough to know what those are, but also being self-aware enough to know what they aren't.
Yes,
and I would argue most boards have lots of talent, tons.
Huge.
They're not necessarily being utilized, and part of that is I'll just keep picking on education. They haven't been educated on their purpose. It's not defined what is the purpose of this board. And if you asked everybody in the room, I know you've done this in sort of pre-planning and surveying, sometimes you get, if there's 8 people in the room, you get 7 different answers.
Oh, sometimes if there's 8 people in the room, I'll get 10 different answers.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And having them have that, you're bringing in new directors, new trustees, new members of the governing body, the custodians of the organization. Challenging them around that is critical and actually challenging people and educating people before they get to the boardroom, before they even get to the election process. And the second point, we said, what's the first thing? Education for who you've got in the room right now. But then as part of your succession planning process and managing your talent pipeline, making people aware of what is expected of them when they put themselves forward for election or appointment to the board is critical. Don't people like to sort of dress it up because they're afraid people will be put off and they won't put themselves forward because it'll feel like, I'd rather have nobody put themselves forward because it was a terrible prospect than 15 people all get on a board and have no idea what they're doing and it ends in catastrophe. So part of that is the succession planning piece as well. And, a lot of the time boards, kind of non-profit boards in particular, feel like they'll be perceived as interfering if they, with the government, with the election process or the governance piece, if they're involved in managing the talent pipeline. But my position is, well, as custodians of the organization, your responsibility is not just to promote and protect its interests now. It's about looking at the future, well beyond when you've been on the board. And part of that is saying to people, we've got a mentoring program, for example, or, around governance as leadership pieces or whatever. And so there's plenty of ways to do it. But for me, the education and the succession planning, those are the two pieces that really shore up the stability and the focus of the board of directors, and allows the board and the senior executive to work as two sides of the same leadership coin. So they stop competing with one another, and then they start complementing one another and working as part of the same system. Because I think, again, one of the issues that I see organizations struggling with is recognizing that every element of the association is part of the same system. And I think getting people to start talking and understanding the value of systems thinking as part of the leadership proposition
Yeah.
again, the impact is huge.
How many organizations, in your experience, when you go into one of those settings, have a written description of the role of the chief executive and the role of the board, and those are different? Coming into it, and everybody stands on that opposite side of the same coin, as you said.
Not many.
Yeah.
Not many that I walk into. But then again, I guess that's the nature of my job, isn't it? Is I get brought in because of the organizations who are fly-in, they never want me in, unless it's to sort of do some sort of performance appraisal, assessment of the board. Because again, that's a big piece that I advocate is, yes, you train people, yes, you support people, but yes, you also have to assess their performance. Otherwise, how are you ever going to support them in the long term? If there's areas that they're lacking, knowledge that they're lacking, skills that they don't, that they don't possess, you have to be able to identify that. And part of that is to do an annual sort of assessment of their progress, of their confidence and competence as directors. But no, it's very rare that I'll walk in and they've got that kind of clearly mapped roles and responsibilities, and are truly working, in tandem. Yeah,
I wish more folks, there seems to, when you say the word strategic planning, I think for most people, I'm very general here, most people think that if they go to strategic planning, especially if they're first, they're going to come up with the initiatives for next year. And that's the purpose of being there. And I've found more often, sometimes you can't even get there because there's all these other issues with regard to communications, roles and responsibilities, that kind of are puzzle pieces that need to be fit in before you can even get to the stuff that's a level down, which is what we should be doing. It's who's doing what, and then that vision component coming back to the civic duty, the first lens. Are we looking through that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've had, I remember it distinctly, being asked to come in and work with the board to, just well, they called it strategic planning. I think they wanted sort of a visioning session, just a day. And I ended up working with them for 3 years because after my first sort of 20 minutes, I realized that there was no coherence around the board table as to what the purpose of the organization was. And, and you think, right, okay. And for me, that was it really exemplified the challenge that these individuals are facing when you say to them, yeah, strategic planning. Right, okay. They're not even necessarily talking the same language. I mean, yeah, and that was a big board. There was like 25 of them. Oh, God, it was too big. And I did have, half a dozen different perspectives on why the organization exists. Well, there was no way I could strategic plan with them if they all had different purpose. If they thought the reason the organization existed was different, I couldn't ever come up with a realistic strategic plan for them. So we had to just scrap everything. And I took the chief exec out the room and said, right, we had a coffee break 20 minutes in. And I said, we need to just go back to basics on this and get them to really sort of analyze and assess, why does this organization exist? And then from that, why are we in the room and what are we going to be talking about? And again, guiding them. Again, it's like you said, the boardrooms are full of clever people. I've never walked in a boardroom and thought, God, why is that person? Why is that lump of coal sitting there? My God, they're useless. But if they're not given direction and support and training and guidance and mentoring and ongoing assessment and continuing professional development, they're never going to work as an asset for the organization. They're only ever going to be perceived as the enemy by the staff. And I've got a couple of clients on at the moment, and they both have this headache. The board is frustrated with the staff. The staff are purposely keeping the board at arm's length. No, the board doesn't know what it's supposed to be doing. and then they just fill in the gaps. Like I said, they just fill in the gaps. And then that frustrates the staff because staff think, well, don't you trust me? And then you have all these questions about culture and interpersonal dynamics and what have you. And it's like, wow, this all could have been avoided.
Yeah.
This all could have been avoided if you just got me in sort of 5 years ago.
I think it's really, really important to point out to our audience, or anybody, listening to these types of conversations, that, we could sit here and what sounds like board bash. And the reality is we're just really excited and passionate about our industry being successful. And these are not, these aren't faults of anybody within these environments necessarily. No. They're real opportunities. And I say that as genuinely as I can, as somebody we now bring in an outside facilitator, and I always will. With any organization I'm part of, I will bring in an outside facilitator, because they will show you the sides of you that you don't see. Yeah. And, what seems like, X dollars, I promise you all, if you're listening, it's worth the investment. I've just never had somebody who's gone through the process well with the right facilitator and gone, wow, that was a waste of money. In fact, most of the time they go, wow, I wish I had done that way earlier. And it's these little blind spots that we all have. Again, it sounds like we're board bashing or CEO bashing. I'm telling you, even myself, and I'm sure you in the same spot, Andrew, would say we all have blind spots, right?
Oh, God, yeah. Oh, my God. Oh, yeah. Blind spots. I practically walk around with blinkers on when I was a chief executive. I was.
This is it.
That's it exactly. Yeah. Can I look now? No, can I look now? No, absolutely. And I think, that's one of the most frustrating parts for me is that people volunteer, and volunteering is the lifeblood of membership organizations. And I don't want people I would hate for the listeners to think that I don't recognize that, because I do. And why I'm frustrated is because they bring to the table all the energy and enthusiasm, expertise, the relationships, the networks. I know associations. I know how to run associations. But I have never, ever been able to run an association without heavily leaning on the volunteers, the boards, the committee members, the volunteers whose knowledge and expertise of the industry is absolutely fundamental to the success of the organization. And that's why I say you need one side to work with the other and complement and support and not compete. And it's the competing that I'm bashing, not the energy and the enthusiasm. And also, I hate to see that energy and enthusiasm sort of be wasted, by people who are working, who are volunteering for one thing, and it never materializes to be what they think it is.
Absolutely. This is one of those conversations I think we could just keep taping for hours. And I always have the unfortunate task of wrapping us up and closing us out. But I do like this portion of our show where we sort of turn the microphone back to you, Andrew, and ask for a recommendation on somebody that from your network you think could also be add a valuable component and share good stories with the association on our show.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Well, obviously we've spent a lot of time talking about the social impact, the civic responsibilities that associations can realize. And so for me, I would highly recommend talking with Alison Heppenstall, who is the co-founder. No, I think she's the founder, actually, the full founder. I'm sorry, Alison, you're the full founder of Climate Action for Associations, which is a network of membership bodies dedicated to understanding and then implementing how associations can tackle the climate crisis. Not separately, but tackle it together, as an industry, as a global industry. And I think, Alison's done some tremendous work since putting CAFA together. And I would highly recommend that she comes on board and has a really good chat. She'll have tons of good stuff to say.
Excellent. Well, I hope she accepts our request and look forward to the conversation. Andrew, thank you again for your time and joining us here on the other side of the microphone.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you. I've enjoyed it. I actually talk a lot more when Elisa's not on a podcast with me, I've noticed, but we won't tell her that. She'll find out soon enough.
She'll listen, I'm sure.
Thanks, Lucas. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.